David and Melissa Harper were the couple everyone admired. He was polished and successful. She was kind and soft-spoken. But behind the white picket fence and holiday photo smiles was a secret rotting beneath the surface. When Melissa vanished, without a trace, neighbors blamed depression, maybe even suicide. What they didn't know was that David hadn't lost his wife. He had buried her, piece by piece, under the weight of control, cruelty, and a single twisted belief that she was no longer worthy of love because she was overweight. David and Melissa Harper had what most people would call an ideal life. They lived in a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood on the edge of Little Rock, Arkansas. Their two-story colonial-style home was always clean, their lawn perfectly trimmed, their golden retrievers always groomed and friendly. To anyone looking from the outside, they were a picture-perfect couple. David was a well-known financial advisor, always dressed in tailored suits, punctual and confident. Melissa was once a dedicated elementary school teacher, loved by her students and coworkers alike. But a few years ago, she left her job without much explanation. Most people thought it was to focus on starting a family, but no children ever came. Over time, people stopped asking. Melissa had suffered several miscarriages, each one more painful than the last. Quietly, her emotional and physical health began to deteriorate. She put on weight, gradually at first, then more rapidly as her depression deepened. Friends noticed her once bright personality dimming, her laughter less frequent, her presence at social gatherings rare. David, meanwhile, remained active in the community, attending charity events, golf outings, and company functions, almost always alone. Melissa's isolation wasn't immediate, it happened in increments. Book club meetings missed, then canceled. Calls to friends returned late, if at all. When she did appear, she seemed distracted, nervous even, like she was apologizing for her existence. When asked how she was doing, she gave short, vague answers. "I'm working on myself," she would say, "trying to get healthy." Some assumed she was just taking time to heal from her losses, but others sensed something was off. David, for his part, never spoke ill of Melissa in public. He still called her his wife, still referred to her fondly in conversation, but there was a coldness in his tone. He had stopped posting pictures of them together online, replacing couples' photos with professional shots of himself at conferences and meetings. The only recent pictures of Melissa were older ones, reposted on anniversaries or birthdays, showing a thinner version of her with glowing skin and a bright smile. None of the current Melissa ever appeared. Behind the facade, things at home were unraveling. David became controlling, pressuring Melissa to diet, exercise, and monitor every calorie. He tracked her routines, critiqued her meals, and subtly undermined her confidence. He didn't shout or hit. There were no bruises, but his cruelty was quiet and constant. Melissa started journaling her meals and recording her weight every day, not because she wanted to, but because David demanded it. Her life was reduced to numbers, pounds, calories, steps. She tried to push back at first, but his disappointment was always swift and punishing. Silent treatments, snide remarks. He slept in the guest room for days when she broke a promise to cut carbs. Her world shrank until the only thing she thought about was his approval. Even the dogs began to sense the tension. They barked more at night, lingered near her when David was in the room. But no one outside the house could see any of it. By early 2021, Melissa was barely seen. Neighbors rarely caught more than a glimpse of her through the curtains or in the backyard late at night. She had deleted most of her social media accounts and hadn't posted anything in nearly a year. Even her family had grown distant. When her sister tried to visit, Melissa claimed she was too sick or that David was busy with work and couldn't host anyone. One by one, people stopped trying. Then, one rainy Monday night, Melissa was seen watering her garden just before dusk. It was strange, given the forecast, but she was out there in a large sweatshirt, sleeves rolled up, dragging a hose across the flower bed. A neighbor across the street waved. Melissa looked up, gave a faint nod, and returned to her task. That would be the last time anyone ever saw her. The next morning, David called the police to report her missing. He said she had gone for an early walk to clear her head and never returned. He sounded calm, even helpful. He told them she had been trying to get in shape again, that she had a goal to walk 10,000 steps each day, and maybe she had pushed herself too hard. When officers arrived, they found Melissa's phone on the kitchen counter. Her purse and keys were still hanging by the door. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, nothing that pointed clearly to foul play. Just a woman who had seemingly vanished into thin air. And David, looking concerned, answered every question without hesitation. Melissa Harper's disappearance quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. In a quiet community where unusual events were rare, the sudden vanishing of a well-known resident raised questions and fears. Volunteers formed search parties, walking through wooded trails, drainage ditches, and nearby parks. Flyers with Melissa's face and description were posted on streetlights and community boards. Her photo, a smiling, healthy woman from a few years earlier, was plastered on local news broadcasts, though many noticed she looked different from the person they'd last seen. David appeared to be a grieving, worried husband. He spoke to reporters, thanking volunteers and pleading with the public to come forward with any information. He kept repeating the same story. Melissa had gone for a walk early in the morning and never came back. He claimed she had taken her usual route, a path around the neighborhood lake. But police could not find a single neighbor, jogger, or camera that had seen her on that route that day. The weather had been rainy, and most people stayed inside. Even the security cameras along the main road failed to catch a glimpse of her. When officers reviewed David's timeline, they began to notice inconsistencies. He told dispatchers he had waited a few hours before reporting her missing, but phone records showed he had called his office, a landscaping service, and even his dentist during that same window. He had only contacted police around noon, nearly 6 hours after she had allegedly left the house. When asked why he delayed, David claimed he thought Melissa had simply gone out longer than usual. He said he didn't want to overreact, but police knew something was off. Melissa's phone remained untouched. Her last text was to a former coworker, sent around 9:12 p.m. the night before she vanished. It was a short, polite message canceling plans for lunch the following week. The tone was casual, but the coworker described Melissa as sounding distant in earlier messages, like she was distracted or under pressure. Her activity on social media had been non-existent for months, and she hadn't made any purchases or bank transactions recently. Her gym membership hadn't been used in over a year. That a search of the Harper home revealed nothing alarming at first glance. The kitchen was spotless, the living room immaculate, the bedrooms tidy. But when crime scene technicians brought in cadaver dogs, one of the animals alerted near the backyard garden shed. It was a faint indication, and rain had soaked the soil, possibly washing away potential evidence. Still, it raised suspicion. Investigators requested a warrant for a more thorough search, but without solid leads or visible signs of a crime, it was denied. Meanwhile, David began to distance himself from the investigation. He stopped attending search briefings and politely declined further interviews. He said the stress was too much. Friends who visited him said he looked exhausted, but they also noted that he seemed strangely composed. He wasn't frantic or emotional. Some thought he might be in shock. Others weren't so sure. By the second week, tips from the public started to slow. A few people claimed to have seen someone who looked like Melissa near a gas station or walking along a country road, but none of the sightings were confirmed. Detectives were left with theories, but no hard proof. Had she run away? Had she fallen into a body of water? Or had something far worse happened? The lead detective on the case, Angela Moran, wasn't ready to give up. She ordered a deeper look into David's finances, phone records, and online activity. What they found suggested a much darker reality. David had been using encrypted messaging apps to communicate with a woman named Erica. The messages, recovered from cloud backups, revealed a long-term affair. He had told Erica that he was trapped in a loveless, unhealthy marriage and often complained that Melissa was ruining his life. The tone of the messages grew colder over time. He referred to Melissa as a burden and said he was considering radical solutions to get his life back. Erica, who lived in another state, told investigators she had no idea Melissa was missing until she saw the news. She ended the relationship immediately and agreed to hand over her messages with David. Police now had motive, resentment, control, and infidelity, but they still didn't have a body or enough evidence to charge him. David, aware that he was being watched, lawyered up and stopped cooperating entirely. Public opinion began to shift. People who once offered sympathy now whispered behind his back. The news station stopped calling it a missing persons case and started using words like suspicious circumstances and potential foul play. David placed the house on the market less than 3 months after Melissa vanished. He cited bad memories and a desire for a fresh start. But many saw it differently. To them, he was escaping. And as he packed up his belongings and left the neighborhood behind, one quiet question lingered in every conversation. Where was Melissa Harper? Months passed, and Melissa Harper's name slowly began to fade from the headlines. The search efforts dwindled, and public interest shifted to other stories. Her face was still pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores, and her name occasionally appeared in missing persons databases. But in the eyes of many, the case had gone cold. David Harper had sold the house, moved into a modern apartment across town, and returned to his work in finance with surprising ease. He rarely spoke about Melissa anymore. When asked, he gave a rehearsed answer. He was still grieving, but life had to go on. Detectives weren't convinced. Though there was still no physical evidence of a crime, David remained their prime suspect. Detective Angela Moran, unwilling to let the case slip into obscurity, quietly reopened the investigation behind the scenes. She requested deeper forensic analysis of the garden area where the cadaver dog had alerted. She also authorized an extensive background check on David. Beyond his public persona and polished reputation, the deeper investigators dug, the darker the image of David became. He wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a man obsessed with control and image. Interviews with former co-workers and friends painted a picture of someone who was charming in public but cold and domineering in private. One former colleague described him as someone who hated failure in any form. Another remembered a heated conversation where David complained about his wife's refusal to get better after her miscarriages. His frustration had less to do with her pain and more with how it made him look. David's online life revealed even more disturbing insights. He had been a regular contributor to forums and private chat groups focused on extreme body standards, male superiority, and weight loss ideologies. In these digital spaces, hidden behind anonymous usernames, he described Melissa as a selfish quitter who had given up on herself and on him. He wrote that he felt trapped and believed people who neglected their appearance were choosing laziness over love. Investigators found dozens of posts from David just weeks before Melissa disappeared, all hinting at a growing resentment. Some of his posts discussed cleansing your life of dead weight, a phrase he used more than once. Detective Moran began to build a timeline that pointed not just to motive, but to premeditation. She discovered purchases made by David weeks before Melissa vanished: several large bags of quicklime, industrial-strength trash bags, work gloves, and a shovel, all from a hardware store 2 towns over. He paid in cash, but surveillance footage from the store clearly showed David's face. When asked about the items during an earlier interview, he had claimed he was working on a landscaping project, yet no such project had ever been observed by neighbors or mentioned to friends. Further investigation revealed that David had also rented a commercial carpet cleaner and pressure washer the day after Melissa disappeared. He had returned both the same evening. While that alone wasn't suspicious, the rental store's employee remembered how anxious David seemed. He had asked multiple times whether the machines left any kind of trace or required special chemicals for pet messes. The man thought it was odd, given how clean David's house appeared during pickup. The most critical lead, however, came from an anonymous email sent to the police tip line. The sender claimed to have known David from an online fitness community. The message was brief but chilling. Check the shed floor. He talked about building a false base. Investigators immediately obtained a second warrant, this time with stronger justification. When forensic teams returned to the now-vacant Harper property, they began a detailed excavation of the shed area. They discovered that the shed floor was not part of the original property construction. Beneath layers of concrete and dirt, they uncovered a concealed cavity about 4 feet deep. It was empty, but the walls showed signs of chemical burns and scorched material. Samples taken from the soil tested positive for human DNA. Though badly degraded, a mitochondrial match linked it to Melissa's maternal line. For detectives, this was the confirmation they had waited for. David may have removed or destroyed the body, but the shed had once held it. The presence of quicklime and chemical residue indicated an attempt to accelerate decomposition. Though a body had not yet been recovered, the evidence now told a silent but powerful story. Melissa hadn't vanished. She had been hidden. Detective Moran prepared the case for the district attorney. The digital messages, purchases, timeline, inconsistencies, and forensic discoveries built a strong foundation for charges. Prosecutors agreed. A quiet surveillance operation began, and on a gray morning in early March, David Harper was arrested outside his office building. He offered no resistance. He simply handed over his phone, got into the patrol car, and said nothing. The case was no longer a mystery. It was a question of justice, and how far a man would go to preserve his perfect image. News of David Harper's arrest spread quickly. Local television stations led with the story, splashing Melissa's smiling face across the screen once again. After nearly a year of silence and speculation, the community finally had an answer to the question that had haunted them. What happened to Melissa? The police press conference confirmed that while her full remains had not yet been recovered, forensic evidence suggested Melissa had been killed and concealed in the very backyard shed volunteers had walked past dozens of times during the initial search. At the police station, David refused to speak. His attorney issued a brief statement denying all charges, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and unreliable. But inside the district attorney's office, the mood was confident. Though the case lacked a complete body, the combination of digital communications, suspicious purchases, and forensic traces told a grim but coherent story. The prosecution team assembled the timeline meticulously, presenting a chilling pattern of emotional abuse, isolation, and premeditation. They would argue that Melissa hadn't just died. She had been erased. With David in custody, investigators expanded their search. The current owners of David's former home gave permission for a full excavation of the garden area. Over the following weeks, forensic archaeologists carefully removed layers of soil beneath the shed, using ground-penetrating radar to identify irregularities. Near the outer edge of the garden, just beneath a thick section of decorative bricks, searchers uncovered partial skeletal remains. They were wrapped in heavy plastic and weighed down with dumbbells. The discovery included pieces of Melissa's clothing, still faintly recognizable, and her wedding ring, bent and tarnished but intact. Dental records confirmed the remains were Melissa's. Though no cause of death could be officially determined due to decomposition, the positioning of the bones suggested blunt force trauma and concealment. The recovery gave the prosecution exactly what they needed: a body to confirm the crime and a burial site that matched David's purchases, timeline, and actions. The remains were sent for final analysis, and Melissa's family was notified. After nearly a year of uncertainty, they were finally given the truth they had feared. The trial began in late October. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, community members, and friends of the Harpers sat quietly, waiting to hear how a man who appeared to love his wife had so thoroughly destroyed her. Prosecutors opened with a simple statement. This wasn't a case of sudden rage or a terrible accident. It was a murder built on contempt, obsession, and control. They presented David's internet history, forum posts, and private messages to the jury. His own words betrayed him. He had complained about Melissa's weight, her depression, and how she had let herself go. He spoke often of being trapped and wanting to start over. To support their argument of premeditation, they showed receipts for quicklime, cleaning agents, and equipment purchased just days before Melissa vanished. Footage from hardware stores captured David picking up supplies while Melissa was still alive. Forensic experts testified about the garden shed, the hidden cavity beneath it, and the discovery of human remains. They explained the chemical burns found on the walls, consistent with attempts to dissolve organic material. The DNA evidence, though partial, placed Melissa's genetic markers in the very location where David had spent hours after her disappearance. A cell tower analysis showed his phone had stayed at the house the entire night, and morning, he claimed she went for a walk. The defense tried to discredit the timeline and argue that Melissa had been mentally unwell, even suggesting she may have taken her own life, and that David had panicked. They tried to plant doubt by pointing out the lack of a definitive cause of death and the absence of eyewitnesses. But their efforts were thin and scattered. The mountain of circumstantial and physical evidence, combined with David's disturbing online activity, proved too much to overcome. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. David Harper showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He stood still, eyes forward, hands folded in front of him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led out of the courtroom, Melissa's sister quietly wept, clutching the photograph of her sibling that had been held up during the trial's opening. Outside the courthouse, people gathered, candles lit, photos of Melissa displayed with flowers and handwritten messages. The town mourned not just for her death, but for the years of silent suffering she had endured. In her final moments, she had been alone, stripped of dignity by someone she had trusted most. But now, in the eyes of the public, her story had meaning. Her memory was no longer a mystery. It was a warning and a call to pay attention to what happens behind closed doors. The garden where she was buried was later torn out and replaced with a small memorial, funded by community donations. A plaque was installed that read, "In memory of Melissa Harper. May we never ignore silence and never mistake appearance for peace." In the months following David Harper's conviction, the community of Little Rock remained shaken. The Harper case wasn't just another headline that faded after the trial. It was a mirror held up to a town that had long ignored the quiet suffering behind closed doors. Melissa's death had left a permanent mark. Her story had become a rallying cry, not just about domestic violence, but about the emotional control and body shaming that can be just as deadly as any physical blow. Local advocacy groups began hosting seminars and workshops on emotional abuse and coercive control, topics that had rarely been discussed so openly before. Melissa's name was often mentioned in these talks, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that abuse doesn't always look like bruises and broken bones. Sometimes it looks like silence, weight charts on the fridge, and a partner who smiles in public but withholds affection behind closed doors. Her life and tragic death forced people to reevaluate what they thought they knew about healthy relationships. The memorial at the site of her former home became a place of reflection. Strangers stopped by to leave flowers or messages, often sharing personal stories in notebooks left beside the plaque. Some wrote about sisters, friends, or mothers they had lost to similar fates. Others admitted they hadn't recognized the signs of Melissa's suffering when they had the chance. One note simply read, "I'm sorry I didn't ask you more questions." Her absence now echoed more loudly than her presence ever had for Melissa's family. The pain didn't end with the verdict. Her sister, Rachel, was left with lingering guilt and the burden of navigating a grief that refused to fade. She had trusted David for years, never suspecting the depth of his cruelty. In the quiet moments after the cameras were gone and the trial had ended, she began working with a national organization focused on advocating for psychological abuse victims. She gave speeches at universities, talked to survivors, and started a fund in Melissa's name to support women leaving emotionally abusive relationships. Through it all, she made sure Melissa's story wasn't just about how she died, but how she lived and how she tried to hold herself together while being slowly broken down. David Harper, now serving a life sentence in a maximum security facility, became a subject of public fascination for a time. Journalists requested interviews, true crime podcasts dissected his background, and experts debated the psychology behind his need for control. But David declined every media request. He didn't speak in court, didn't issue apologies, and didn't offer explanations. In prison, he kept to himself, reportedly spending most of his time alone in his cell. Whatever justification he had given himself for what he did was never made public. He remained a silent figure, his outward charm now stripped away, exposed for what it truly was, a mask hiding something darker. Melissa's home, which had once been the setting of unimaginable betrayal, was eventually torn down. The land was converted into a public garden, paid for by donations from hundreds of strangers. It wasn't grand, just a small, peaceful space with benches, wildflowers, and a gentle stone path. The idea was simple: create something beautiful, where something awful had happened. Children now ran through the space. Birds built nests in the hedges, and families sat beneath the trees unaware of the horrors once buried there. But for those who knew the truth, the garden stood as both a tribute and a quiet warning. The case sparked national conversations about the subtle ways people are devalued in relationships. Social media erupted with stories from women who had been told they weren't enough, too fat, too emotional, too flawed. Many said Melissa's story gave them the courage to leave toxic situations. Others admitted they still didn't know how to. But either way, the silence had been broken. The world had seen what happened when cruelty wore a suit and tie, when abuse hid behind polite smiles and perfect lawns. Melissa Harper had been a teacher, a wife, a sister, and a friend. But she had also been a victim long before her death, unseen, unheard, and slowly diminished until there was almost nothing left. In the end, though, she became something more. Her story forced people to pay attention, to ask hard questions, and to understand that love without respect is not love at all. Though her voice was taken from her, it now echoed through every courtroom, every classroom, every conversation about invisible wounds. And in that way, Melissa Harper finally became impossible to ignore.